Hello, everyone. I'm Chris Trant with HedgePoint Global Markets. I'm the head of U.S. Agriculture in Chicago. Thank you for joining us for another installment of our updates on the Black Sea and the Ukraine. Today, we're going to discuss the recent collapse of the Nova Kakhovka Dam and the impacts on Ukraine's wheat market. First, we're going to discuss what actually occurred with the collapse of the dam. Second, we're going to discuss what that means for supply and demand Ukrainian wheat. And finally, we're going to wrap up with how this fits in with the upcoming grain corridor extension next month. Let's start with what actually occurred. On June 6th, the morning of June 6th, the Nova Kakhovka Dam suffered a collapse. It was one of Europe's largest ecological and environmental disasters in decades. The water level at that time was at a 30-year high, and it occurred at the very beginning of Ukraine's current counteroffensive. The reservoir that was created by this dam was critical not only for humanitarian reasons, but also for irrigation and agriculture, and perhaps most importantly, supplying the cooling pond on the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plants. The International Atomic Agency reported that the risk of the plants had, quote, dramatically increased, but there were other sources of water available. Now, this nuclear plant sits in the heart of Ukraine's wheat belt, meaning that's a very, very sensitive area, and any increase in risk, obviously, is very concerning. Now, the immediate impact of the flooding caused by the dam were contained to about 10,000 hectare-acres of land. The Ukrainian Environmental Protection and Natural Resources Ministry said that the topsoil on these 10,000 hectare-acres were immediately washed away, making it very difficult to grow on this land for years to come. That's definitely concerning, definitely going to impact Ukraine's upcoming wheat harvest. However, it's less than 1% of Ukraine's total wheat planted area. The bigger issue, in my opinion, will be what happens when Ukrainian farmers make the next crop planting intentions. Ukrainians will begin their harvest next month, and they will plant next year's wheat crop in September. This reservoir actually supplied 31 irrigation systems in 3 surrounding oblasts, leaving a large question on if Ukraine will be able to plant on these grounds in the same efficiency that they have in years past. Now, looking at the actual impact on the current production, this area is important for Ukraine's wheat production. However, the immediate region was not growing a whole lot because of the conflict. Now, there are parts of the Dnieper River that suffered a flash flood, and there are parts of the river further upstream that actually experienced a flash evaporation of water. This obviously has a large consequence for future planting and future irrigation in these regions. The 3 areas surrounding this dam, in 2021, before the invasion, they grew 4 million metric tons of grain and oilseeds, and they harvested on 580,000 hectare acres, meaning that for next year, when Ukrainian farmers plant, they'll have a large question mark on how much they can actually yield on these impacted area, not only from the immediate aftermath of the flood, but also for the surrounding area that right now is not impacted. Now, if we turn to our next point, it's going to look at the supply and demand of Ukraine's wheat crop. Now, prior to this collapse of the dam, Ukrainians' wheat crop, all things considered, was fairly solid. The yield actually was higher than last year, and indeed higher than in some years before the invasion. Although overall production was down, the beneficial rains we experienced in Ukraine the last few months aided the wheat crop, and all things being equal, the rest of the country's wheat crop appears to be somewhat on track. The impacted region might have a slight production cut, But overall, the country should still have around the 17.5 million metric tons currently expected, perhaps a shade below that. The bigger issue will be for next year's crop. Now let's dive into Ukraine's supply and demand grid to analyze what might happen. Now, the Ukrainian farmer is already facing a very challenging environment, both for profitability and maintaining their farms. The Ukrainian farmer relies on the export capacity of the country. Domestically, Ukraine can only consume about 36% of the total supply available in the country, meaning without a reliable export corridor, the Ukrainian farmer will not have enough customers to take their production off their hands, which may increase ending stocks in the country, thus deteriorating their farmer's position even further. Now, an upcoming dilemma on this, of course, will be next month's renewal of the Black Sea grain corridor. This will impact both old crop production and, of course, the future new crop production. Next month, Ukraine will begin their harvest of their crop. In September, they will make decisions on planting for their new crop. The Ukrainian export window goes from July into the fall, meaning we're at a very critical time for both old crop demand and for new crop planting intentions in the coming weeks and months ahead. Looking at Ukraine's current share of the global export markets, they're currently 5% of the total wheat export market versus about 10% before the war. So while they're smaller, it's still the most critical parts of the Ukrainian farmer profitability. Consequently, the grain corridor extension is critical to maintaining Ukraine's export capacity and therefore farmer overall profitability, which will influence the planting intentions for next year. Now, the main buyers of Ukrainian exported wheat are Egypt, Indonesia, and Turkey. Without an effective grain export corridor program, much of this business will probably be pushed towards Russia. Now let's conclude with the grain export corridor renewal and the implications ahead. The grain export corridor renewal is set to expire on July 16th, next month, and that's right before Ukraine begins their old crop wheat harvest. Russia has made it clear that they have demands that must be met to allow the corridor to continue. Their 5 demands range from relief on sanctions to a resumption of Russian fertilizer exports out of Odessa. Most critically, it means a return to the Russian Agriculture Bank to the global SWIFT, something that has been a sticking point. The Russian Agriculture Bank is 100% state-owned. In fact, after the invasion of Ukraine last year, one of the first sanctions to be placed on Russia was the banning from the global SWIFT payment system. It's very unlikely that the West will allow the Russian state to access the global SWIFT after working so hard to get these sanctions on in the first place, especially in the context of continued fighting in Ukraine. Regardless of these demands, the grain corridor has had recent delays in inspections. The amount of volume going out of these ports has declined, and the inspection time has shown that it will increase as Russia tries to wrap up pressure on Ukraine and the West to meet their demands. So the corridor itself is still not operating at a healthy level. Should no corridor be extended, however, this will make the current problem significantly worse, but it will not eliminate Ukrainian wheat exports entirely. Without the grain corridor extension, Ukraine will have to rely either on truck transportation into the EU for their exports or Danube River ports bordering Romania. When it comes to the truck side, there appears to be some issues there as well. Recently, 5 Eastern European countries banned the Ukrainian truck grain imports into their country, increasing Ukrainian reliance on export vessels to nearly 90% of their total exports leaving the country. Most of that 90% came from the Odessa grain corridor export ports. If those ports are turned off because of the inability of, or the the non-extension of the grain corridor, Ukraine will have to rely solely on the Danube River ports bordering Romania. Now, these ports have had significant investment and capacity increases since the war started. Before the war, they represented about 1.5% of Ukraine's total wheat exports. They're currently approaching 20%, meaning that even without the truck exports to the EU and without the Odessa grain corridor ports, Ukraine will still be able to export some of their wheat. However, it'll probably be close to half of what they're currently able to ship out now. That will further increase stocks in Ukraine of the Indian crop from the current harvest, and will likely even decrease further the future planting intentions of the Ukrainian farmer, as they have questions on irrigation because of the Kakhovka Dam explosion and the potential loss of their main area of profitability, which is exports. I want to thank you all for joining us today. We will update you next month when we receive news on the grain corridor extension, and we'll examine what implications happened with the Ukrainian wheat areas that were impacted by this flooding. If you have any questions on risk management or the subject I mentioned, please feel free to reach out to myself or anyone in the HedgePoint team to discuss your risk management needs. And thank you for joining us once again. We look forward to talking to you soon. Take care.